EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. New York City Mayor Bill DeBlasio wants to scrap the entrance exam that determines whether students gain admission to the city's lauded top-tier high schools. That's a move that has some equity advocates cheering, but a large number of students and families crying foul. Joining us to talk about this and the educational equity challenges facing the nation's largest school district is Christina Veiga of Chalkbeat, New York. She joins us now. Christina, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a primer for our audience about how this specialized exam works. Who takes it?
So 8th graders take it who are vying for spots for the next year in high school. They have to sign up in September or October, so pretty much right when school starts. They have to know that they want to do this and be prepared for it already, and then they take it at the end of October.
So it looks like about 28,000 students might take this exam, but there's only 5,000 spots. Where are those seats?
The seats are in 8 schools that require the specialized high schools test. There's also another school that is a performing arts school and that requires audition. So that's outside of the testing process.
That's just a handful of New York City's total high schools. And there are a lot of campuses that have strong track records that don't require this exam. So why is this exam getting so much attention?
These specialized high schools really do hold a special place in sort of the culture of New York City and going to high school. They're sort of held out as the top crown jewels, whatever superlative you want to use. A lot of people who have gone on to win Nobel Prizes and that sort of thing have attended these schools. And so they just sort of hold a really special place in the minds of folks here in New York City.
Essentially, we're talking about New York City's Ivy League.
Basically.
And what is the mayor's argument for wanting to scrap this test?
The mayor has been talking about diversity at these specialized high schools basically since he was running for office. While citywide Black and Hispanic students are about 70% of the population, they make up only about 10% of enrollment at the specialized high schools, which is really stark. And so this test has for a long time been seen as one of the main barriers to the schools being more integrated. And so he's hoping to convince the state legislature to scrap the test because ultimately the specialized high schools admission test is required by state law. And that's why New York City uses it. We're the only city that bases admission to these exam schools based on just one single measure, this test.
But before it even gets to a legislative vote, this case could be headed to court. There's a lawsuit right now related to some of these underlying issues about the specialized exam. Who are the plaintiffs and what are they asking for?
Well, the lawsuit doesn't target the test. It targets this other phase of the city's diversity efforts, which is expanding this program called the Diversity Program. And basically, it offers admission to students who scored below the cutoff and who attend a summer program. The city wants to expand the program so that more students get in that way, and also change the eligibility requirements so that, according to the city, it targets the most disadvantaged students, partially because right now the city already has a discovery program and it's mostly benefiting Asian students who are more likely to be taking the test and therefore more likely to be right below the cutoff. So that's what the lawsuit is targeting. They're being represented by the Pacific Legal Foundation, which has been described a lot of ways, libertarian, right-leaning, that sort of thing. And it's a group of parents from a middle school here that has historically sent the bulk of their 8th graders on to specialized high schools. But basically, it's Asian families who are saying that the expansion of discovery and changing the requirements will leave their students out and that that's a violation of their civil rights.
Well, it's interesting because you're talking about a group of Asian American students and their families, and that sounds similar to a federal lawsuit pending against Harvard University alleging discrimination against Asian American applicants in their admissions process. Where are some of the overlaps here?
It was interesting. The day the lawsuit was filed, there was a sort of very small community meeting in Brooklyn of some parents and advocates who were behind filing the suit. And a lot of them pointed to the Harvard case and this feeling that the success that Asian students have managed to have in the American school system is sort of being eroded or chipped away at or targeted. And this idea here in New York City that this test is not biased because it doesn't include factors, such as interviews and that sort of thing that maybe parents fear their students would be at a disadvantage for. They feel like this test avoids all of those problems and is an unbiased way for their kids to get in. So there's definitely some echoes, I think, between the two.
Test prep for the specialized high school exam is a big business in New York, isn't it? I mean, you could theoretically cram for this entrance exam and improve your score.
Yeah, there's a really big culture of test prep for this test. And a lot of advocates say that that's what makes it tough for more disadvantaged students to get in, students who maybe don't know that they have to start preparing so soon or whose parents can't afford test prep. On the other hand, a lot of people in the Asian community say that, our families are disadvantaged too and struggle as well, but they're making huge sacrifices to prepare their kids to take this test, and they shouldn't be punished for that.
Let me ask this, though. The city has made some efforts in recent years to get more students of color, specifically Black and Hispanic students, taking that exam, but it's just not translating into higher numbers. What are the hurdles?
Well, a lot of advocates would point back to this idea of prep. And at the end of the day, there's always going to be someone who's going to be able to afford to start sooner, have more test prep sessions and that sort of thing. The city has tried to offer the test on a school day in some schools that are underrepresented, whose students are underrepresented in specialized high schools. They've tried to expand the Discovery program, and so far, none of it has really moved the needle.
If the entrance bar is changed, but the expectations of these schools stay the same, are there concerns that some students are not going to be ready for the academic rigor that's waiting for them?
That's one of the persistent claims that people make for keeping the specialized high schools test, that somehow the schools are going to be watered down or that students are just going to struggle. But for many, when they hear arguments like that, what they hear is that there aren't any Black and Hispanic students in the system now who could do well in these schools, and basically that allowing more Black and Hispanic students into the schools will somehow change the rigor there. And it's, I guess you could call it coded language, but for many people of color, it's not so coded. That's what they hear when they hear arguments about rigor and whether the schools might change.
We're talking with Christina Veiga of Chalkbeat, New York, about covering equity challenges in New York City's public schools. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you for taking a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, a future for everyone, especially our children. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative wants every young person to enter adulthood with the skills and abilities they need to reach their full potential. And they want every teacher to be equipped with the tools and research-based ideas and practices they need to help them get there. Learn more at chanzuckerberg.com/education. EWA retains all control over editorial content. Christina, I want to talk a little bit about this question of education and equity. And obviously, making changes in New York and improving things for students of color who are underserved is about a lot more than changing just one test. What are some of the efforts that are underway at other points in the spectrum, like early childhood education?
This is also an argument that diversity and integration advocates make too. It's been interesting to watch how Mayor DeBlasio's proposal has sort of unfolded, because even people who you would think would be supportive are skeptical because it's such a small focus on a tiny number of high schools and the tiny number of students who would attend them here. And so a lot of advocates are really hoping that the city will look more holistically, not only at the high school level with issues of other high schools also using competitive entrance criteria, but also looking sort of down the system and making sure that Black and Hispanic students have a strong foundation and are able to compete once they get to high school. A lot of folks trace the lack of representation of Black and Hispanic students in specialized high schools back to a lack of Black and Hispanic students in gifted and talented programs. There are many who are skeptical of that argument as well, I have to say. But here in New York City, to get into gifted and talented, usually that means you're taking a test even before you enter kindergarten. And there is also a culture and an industry of test prep for that test as well. We're talking about usually 4-year-olds here. And in many districts for a long time, there were no gifted and talented programs because not enough people were taking the test and scoring high enough to get into those programs. And those were districts where many students were students of color and many students were economically disadvantaged. And so there have been efforts to try to enroll more Black and Hispanic students in gifted programs by starting them in 3rd grade and not relying on this test. But still, you have people who are skeptical of that as well because they say, well, other students are getting this foundation starting in kindergarten. Why are our students only starting in 3rd grade? And so people disagree on the impact of gifted and talented broadly and what to do about the lack of representation of Black and Hispanic students in gifted and talented as well.
In terms of the responsibility for changing diversity and inclusion in New York schools and making it more equitable, we've talked about the mayor, we've mentioned the legislature, but how does Chancellor Richard Carranza fit into this formula? What's his role?
We have to remember that Mayor Bill DeBlasio is Carranza's boss, and Mayor Bill DeBlasio has been far more reluctant to take these issues on, even though he is now proposing this really big change around specialized high schools. Throughout his tenure, integration advocates have sort of been frustrated by the mayor's lack of willingness to even say the words integration and segregation. And so now Carranza is talking far more bluntly about these issues and questioning them out loud and calling attention to practices that many people say contribute to segregation. He's been here about a year now, and a lot of people are hoping that he'll stop talking and start doing. I think that remains to be seen what influence the chancellor is going to be able to have in moving this system towards more integration, the system that is one of the most segregated in the country.
You came to New York City after covering public education in Miami, which is the nation's 4th largest school system. Was there some culture shock for you?
Oh, yes. When I was in Miami, I was the only reporter covering K through 12, and it could get kind of lonely in the newsroom, not many people to sort of bounce ideas off of and talk through issues. And so when I came to Chalkbeat, I thought, oh, wow, we're going to have 3 reporters. We're going to be able to do so much. And then I got here and the scale is just enormous. It's just enormous. And so, yeah, even with 3 reporters every day, it feels like sort of you're drowning in news and you really have to make conscious decisions about what to cover and how to cover it because there's just so much you could be doing any day. I mean, that was the same in Miami as well, but I just don't think you can compare the scale. Something like 76,000 teachers, 2,000 schools, 1 million students. It's overwhelming.
What advice do you have for reporters who might not come from a diverse background, who want to be more mindful about reporting on communities of color, especially when we're talking about issues like this, about educational equity?
I think you have to be aware of the limitations that you bring to those kinds of conversations and do as much research as possible beforehand so that you understand where your blinders might be. It helps to just acknowledge them sometimes and put it right out front and say, listen, I haven't lived this reality, and so I'm here to listen. But, oftentimes parents just want to feel heard. And so, if you're listening respectfully and showing that, you're following up on what they're saying and show that you've understood what they've said and that sort of thing, the same kinds of things that you would do with any interview. You want to show compassion, you want to do your homework, and you want to be aware of what you don't know.
And Christina, what are a few story ideas for local reporters who may be covering issues related to equity and diversity in their own school systems?
I think basically all of education reporting comes down to these issues of diversity and inclusion and equity and who has access and who doesn't. One of the things that I noticed right away when I started covering education is there's just so much data out there. Basically, any question that you have, you can answer either through local, state, federal data. And so, using that as a jumping off point for reporting deeper stories, I think is really helpful. One story that I might recommend for people to look into with this issue of gifted and talented specifically, it's a problem pretty much everywhere that students who are in gifted and talented programs tend to be white, middle class, more so than the district as a whole. And, ProPublica just did a great series that we partnered with them on called Miseducation, where they put out a whole bunch of federal civil rights data. And it would be interesting to look at schools where the gifted population is really starkly different from the overall school population, and just talking to students and parents in that school, I think would paint a really interesting picture of equity or inequity and inclusion. Especially speaking to the students, I find is always interesting because they know whether they're in the quote unquote smart class or not. They see the extra perks that, the kids in the gifted classes get to go on, more field trips or whatever it is. And I think it's really important to talk to parents too, because we shouldn't make assumptions about why they're not choosing gifted programs. There was some interesting research here in New York City that showed that parents of color felt like having to prepare their children for gifted tests meant they weren't really gifted, and so they were less likely to prep for the test. And then once they got to school and they saw a gifted program within their school, they didn't really see the difference between what the kids in the gifted programs were doing and what their own children were doing. They really just saw it as an excuse to separate kids. And so they weren't really interested. And so I think that speaking to people who are living this situation every day, especially the kids and the parents, can be really illuminating.
Christina Veiga covers early childhood education, school diversity, and the Department of Education. She joined us from her office at Chalkbeat, New York. Christina, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you would like to know more about, just drop us a line. We're at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.